Everybody in our valley had an opinion about the man who lived in the rock. Most of them were wrong, and I was the loudest of the wrong ones. I told my wife he'd freeze. I told the boys at the feed store he'd lost his marbles somewhere between the bank that took his land and the wife who took everything else. I wrote it in my own ledger one October night: Calder, living in a cave above the north pasture, won't last the winter. I underlined won't. I want to be honest with you before I tell you the rest, because the man I'm about to describe deserves at least that much from me. I didn't change my mind because I'm wise. I changed it because for 5 days the sky tried to erase us, and the only person who'd seen it coming was the one I'd already decided wasn't worth listening to. This is the story of those 5 days. It's about a stubborn old fool in a hole in the ground, and another stubborn old fool on a ranch who thought he had everything figured out. One of us was about to lose almost everything. The other was about to teach me the difference between crazy and unafraid, and how thin the line between them gets when the wind starts to scream. Stay with me. I promise you it's worth the cold. The first thing I remember is the sound the snow made against the kitchen window, not a tapping, the way a polite storm announces itself, but a steady hiss, like the whole world had become a frying pan. I was 40 feet from my own back door, and I couldn't see it. That's not an exaggeration I'm reaching for to make this sound dramatic. I'd stepped out at 4 in the afternoon to throw a second bale to the horses, the way I'd done 10,000 times, and somewhere between the porch and the loafing shed the air had gone solid. White on white on white. The barn light I'd left burning was a smear, a rumor of yellow, and then it wasn't anything at all. I stood with the twine cutting into my glove, and I had the strangest, stupidest thought a man can have at 61 years old. I don't know which way home is. My name doesn't matter much to this. Folks call me Marsh. I've ranched the same 1,100 acres in this high country my whole life, and my father before me, and I have a habit my wife Dorothy used to call my one true vice: I keep a ledger. Not the money kind, though I keep that too. A weather ledger. 40-some years of it now, stacked in the office in cheap composition books, the kind kids buy for school. Every morning I write the temperature, the wind, what the clouds are doing, whether the cattle are bunched or scattered. I fidget with a busted pocket watch that hasn't told time since the Carter administration while I do it. Dorothy thought it was the saddest hobby a grown man ever had. I think it's the only reason I'm alive to be telling you any of this. Because 3 days before that white afternoon, I'd ridden up the north fence line and found Calder standing outside his cave, looking at the sky like it owed him money. Let me back up and tell you about the man, since I spent so long getting him wrong. Calder showed up in our valley about 14 months before the storm. Nobody invited him, and nobody could have stopped him. He bought, or maybe just claimed, the deed situation was always murky, a worthless rock-strewn quarter section that butted up against my northern boundary. Land so steep and broken even the deer used it mostly as a shortcut. And up in the worst of it, where a limestone shelf had buckled out of the mountainside about 100 years before any of us were born, there was a cave. Not a romantic cave. Not the kind with a fire and a bearskin and a man strumming a guitar like in a song. A cold, low-ceilinged crack in the earth, maybe 30 feet deep, with a mouth you had to stoop to enter. And Calder moved into it the way other men move into a house. Hauled a wood stove up there on a hand sled piece by piece over the course of a week, his breath smoking in the September air. Built a wall of stacked stone and salvaged timber across the front. Cut a hole for a stovepipe. Dug a trench out the side that I later learned was for drainage, and a kind of crude cold cellar. I watched some of it through binoculars from my porch, the way you'd watch a man hammer nails into his own coffin. I felt sorry for him and superior to him in roughly equal measure, which is a combination I'm not proud of now. When I finally rode up to introduce myself, partly neighborliness, partly nosiness, he was splitting wood. He was a big man gone lean, somewhere in his late 50s, with a gray beard he kept short with what turned out to be a pair of sheep shears, and hands that looked like they'd been carved out of the same limestone he lived in. He set down the maul and looked at me, and the thing I noticed first was that he wasn't ashamed. I'd expected shame. A man living in a hole, I figured, would have the decency to be a little embarrassed about it. "You'd be Marsh," he said, not a question. "I would, you're on my fence line. Your fence is 6 feet onto my ground north end, but I don't much care about fences, so we'll leave it." I didn't know what to say to that. It was true, as it happened, the fence was off. My granddad had built it lazy in a dry year, but no one had ever called me on it, and a man living in a cave didn't strike me as someone with the standing to. I asked him the question everybody wanted to ask. I dressed it up, but it came out plain anyway. "You gonna be all right up here come winter?" He picked the maul back up. "Better than you'll be down there," he said, and brought it down and split a round of fur clean in two. "But you won't believe that till you have to." I rode home and wrote in my ledger, "Calder, rude, proud, won't last the winter." And then I underlined "won't" because I was a man who liked to be right, and I'd already decided I was. I told you I'd be honest, so here's a thing I didn't understand for a long time. The reason Calder's choice made me so angry wasn't that I thought it was foolish. It was that some buried part of me, the part that goes out every morning to write down what the sky is doing, recognized something in it. He'd looked at the world and decided it wasn't safe, not the cold, not the wolves, but people, the whole machinery of mortgages and marriages, and the way a life can be taken from you in an afternoon by a man in a suit who's never met you. And he'd walked out of all of it into a hole in the rock, where the only thing that could kill him was honest. I'd never have said that out loud, but I think I felt it, and feeling it scared me, so I called him crazy, because crazy is a fence you can put around a thing to keep it from getting into you. 3 days before the storm, I rode the north line to check the water gap, and I found him outside the cave with his head tipped back. "Afternoon," I said. He didn't answer right off. He pointed his chin at the sky, west and high, where there was nothing I could see but the ordinary blue of a cold, clear October. "You smell that?" I smelled horse and wood smoke, and the iron edge that cold air always has up here. "Smell what?" "Pressure's falling like a stone down a well." He finally looked at me. "There's weather coming off the coast that hasn't decided how mean it wants to be, but it's gonna be mean." He'd been splitting wood again, I realized. There was a stack against the cave wall now taller than he was, 4 cords if it was a stick, and he was still going. "You got enough hay down where your stock can reach it without you?" I bristled. I'd been ranching since he was probably wearing a tie in some city office. "I've wintered cattle on this ground my whole life." "That's not what I asked." He set another round on the block. "I asked if your animals can reach feed for 5 days if you can't get to them." 5 days. He said it like a doctor saying a word you don't want to hear. I told him the forecast called for a system, sure, some snow, nothing the valley hadn't seen. The radio man in town, a fellow named Petey who'd been reading the weather off a wire for 30 years, had said accumulations of 4 to 8 inches gusty. 4 to 8 inches is a Tuesday up here. I told Calder that, with maybe more edge than the man deserved. He listened. Then he said the thing I've thought about every day since. "Your radio man's reading numbers off a paper. I've been watching this sky every hour of every day for 14 months because it's the only neighbor I've got and I don't have the luxury of being wrong about it." He split the round. "You've got a house and a truck and a phone and a wife to call you a fool if you spend 3 days getting ready for nothing. I don't have any of that. Out here, getting ready for nothing is the job. Most days nothing comes, but the day something does, I'm the only one who came." He stacked the halves. "Move your hay, Marsh. Put it where the cows are, not where it's convenient for you. Fill every water trough and every bucket and every kettle you own tonight, because your pump runs on power and your power runs on poles, and poles don't stand up in wind they weren't built for. And I'd bring that gray mare and the old gelding into the barn and shut them in, Because they're the two that'll panic and run into a fence and bleed out in the dark before you ever know they're gone. I want to tell you I listened. I half listened, which is worse, because it let me keep my pride and lose my margin both at once. That night I filled the water troughs. That part I did, mostly to prove to myself I wasn't taking orders from a hermit, which is a funny kind of obedience. I did not move the hay. It was a brutal, cold job, and the cattle were down in the bottoms where they always wintered, 2 miles off, and I told myself I'd do it in the morning. I did not bring the horses into the barn. I left the gray mare and the old gelding out in the loafing shed paddock like always. I went to bed. Dorothy's been gone 4 years now, sudden in the garden, the kind of afternoon disaster I'd built my whole grudge against the world around, and I still sleep on my own side. I lay there listening to a wind that was just starting to find its voice in the eaves, and I thought, he's a crazy old man who scared himself into a cave, and he's trying to scare me into his way of seeing things. And I rolled over and slept the sleep of a man who is about to be very, very wrong. It started as snow at dawn, pretty even, big slow flakes the kind kids stick their tongues out for. By 10 o'clock it had teeth. I've seen a lot of weather. I have 40 composition books that say so, but I have never before or since watched a storm change its mind so fast about what it intended to do to us. The temperature, which had been a reasonable 28, started dropping like that stone-down Calder's well. The wind came around to the northwest and stopped gusting and just blew, a single unbroken pressure against the side of the house that made the windows hum a low note I felt in my teeth. The pretty flakes turned to something smaller and harder and angrier, snow that didn't fall so much as travel sideways, and it kept coming, and it kept coming, and by noon I understood with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with the temperature that this was not 4 to 8 inches. I called Petey's station. The phone was dead, the line, not the receiver. I tried the cell, which up here is a decoration most days, and got nothing. I tried the truck. The truck started. The truck got 40 feet down the drive, and the drive wasn't there anymore. Just a continuous white sea with my fence post sticking out of it like the masts of a sunk fleet. And I had the good sense, barely, to stop and reverse back along my own filling in tracks before they were gone too. The cattle were 2 miles away. The hay was in the wrong barn. And out in the loafing shed paddock, exactly as a crazy man had told me they would, the gray mare and the old gelding were running. I don't know how to make you feel what it is to watch an animal you love panic in a whiteout, so I'll just tell you what I saw and let you sit with it the way I've had to. The gelding Buck, 22 years old, a horse I'd taught my own kids to ride on, a horse with a head as level as a church floor, had lost his mind. The wind does something to a horse. It takes away every sense they steer by. They can't see, can't hear over the roar, can't smell, and the snow drives at their eyes until they'll run blind from a thing that isn't chasing them straight into a thing that is. Buck was running the fence line of the paddock at a dead gallop, the mare behind him, and the fence was the woven wire end post kind that does not give, and I stood at my back door in a coat I'd thrown on over a flannel shirt, and I screamed his name into a wind that ate the sound the instant it left my mouth. I went out. Of course I went out. I'm not telling you that to make myself sound brave. I'm telling you because it's the stupidest thing I did all 5 days, and it nearly killed me. And I want you to understand exactly how a sane, experienced man dies in weather like that. He goes out for a horse. He goes 40 feet. The cold comes through the coat he didn't zip, and the gloves he didn't double, and the wind shoves him sideways, and the world is white in every direction with no up and no down and no barn and no house, and after 90 seconds he cannot feel his face, and after 2 minutes he cannot remember with certainty which way he came, and the panic that's in the horse gets into the man, and that's the whole story. That's how they find you in April. I got maybe halfway to the shed. I heard, over the roar, the sound a horse makes when it hits a fence. I will not describe it to you. I have heard it once and I'll hear it the rest of my life. And then a hand closed on the back of my coat and hauled me, stumbling backward. I didn't even know he was on my place. Calder had his face wrapped in a strip of wool to the eyes, a coil of rope over one shoulder, and a kind of fury in him that I mistook at first for anger at me, and only understood later was something closer to grief. The grief of a man who'd seen exactly this coming and hadn't been able to stop it. "Inside," he shouted, his mouth at my ear, and even at that range I barely heard him. "You go to that house and you do not come back out." "Buck," I started. "Buck's gone, flat, final, the kindest cruelty anyone's ever done me. The mare's standing, I might get the mare, I can't get her and pull you out of a drift both. Pick." I picked. God help me, I went inside. I stood at the window that I couldn't see through and I shook, partly cold and partly something else, and I watched the smear of a man move out into the white with a rope and disappear. He was gone 11 minutes. I know because I had my busted watch in my hand the whole time, the watch that doesn't tell time, and I kept clicking the dead stem like it might suddenly start counting for me, like the storm might agree to be measured. He came back leading the gray mare on the rope. She was bleeding from a long, shallow cut along her chest, and her eyes were rolling white, and she was alive. He put her in the barn, the one I should have put her in the night before, and he shut the door. And he came into my kitchen stamping and shaking and pulled the wool down off his red, raw face. And the first thing he said to me, the very first thing, was not "I told you so." He said, "You're cattle." And I had to tell him I hadn't moved the hay. I expected him to leave. I'd have understood it. I'd done nothing but write him off and ignore him and treat his 14 months of hard-won knowing like the ramblings of a man too broken to live among people. And now my own arrogance had killed a good horse and stranded a herd. And here he was in my kitchen with frost in his beard, and he owed me exactly nothing. He took off his gloves. He looked at his own hands like they belonged to someone else. Then he looked up at me, and the snow hissed against the window, and somewhere out in that white, the wind found a new and lower note, and he said the words that started the longest 5 days of my life. "All right," Calder said. "Then we've got work to do, and we've got till dark to do the first of it, and the storm's not even halfway here." I had thought the storm was already at its worst. That was the second thing I was wrong about. It would not be the last. The first thing Calder did in my kitchen was take inventory of a man who just gotten one of his horses killed, and he did it without a word of comfort, which was the only thing that kept me from coming apart. "Take that wet coat off, dry shirt, 2 pairs of socks if you've got them, wool not cotton." He was already moving through my house like he'd lived there, opening the wood box by the stove, lifting the lid on the kettle. "You eat today." I tried to remember. The morning felt like it had happened to a different man. "Coffee." "You eat now. Bread, anything with fat in it. You're going back out, and a hungry man freezes twice as fast." He found the heel of a loaf and a hunk of cheddar in my icebox and set them in front of me the way you'd set food in front of a child you didn't trust to feed itself. "Then we're getting to your cattle while there's light, because there won't be any tomorrow you can use. I want to stop here and tell you something I didn't have the wits to notice in the moment." He was scared. Not of the storm, he'd made his peace with the storm a long time ago, out there in his rock. He was scared of me, of being responsible for a fool. A man alone has only his own choices to answer for, and Calder had spent 14 months arranging his life so that the only person his mistakes could kill was himself. Now there were 2 of us. And 2 horses and 140 head of cattle 2 miles into the white, and every single one of those lives had become, against his will, his problem. I dragged him out of his clean, simple solitude with my carelessness, and he was furious about it, and he stayed anyway. I've turned that over 1,000 times. I still don't fully understand it. I think maybe a man can decide the whole human race isn't worth his trust and still be unable, when it comes down to it, to stand in a warm kitchen and let his neighbor's animals die in the dark. I think that contradiction is the truest thing I know about him. We couldn't take the truck. We couldn't take the horses. The mare was hurt and shocky, and we weren't about to put Buck's death to any use by killing another one. So we went on foot, with the storm at our backs going out, which Calder said was the only mercy we'd get all day, and we should be grateful for it. He rigged us together. A length of his rope, 12 feet of it, tied around my waist and around his, so that in the white we couldn't lose each other. He'd brought a compass, an actual brass compass on a lanyard, the kind I figured a man only owned for decoration, and he shot a bearing off my barn door before we left its shelter, due south-southeast toward the bottoms, and he made me repeat the number back to him twice. If we get separated, he said, you do not wander, you stop. You turn your back to the wind and you dig down and you wait. The wind's holding northwest. As long as it's on your back, you're walking toward the bottoms. If it ever comes round to your face, you've turned around and you're walking out into open country, and that's where you die. Wind on your back. Say it. Wind on my back. That's your compass in case mine quits. Now move. I've walked that 2 miles 1,000 times in my life. I have walked it drunk, and I have walked it grieving, and I have walked it at 2 in the morning in lambing season, half asleep on my feet. I had never walked it like this. The wind shoved us along like it had a hand flat between our shoulders. The snow was past my knees in the open and over my waist in the swales, and we didn't so much walk as wade and lunge and fall and get up. The cold was a living thing that found every gap, the inch of wrist between glove and cuff, the place where a scarf works loose. And the sound. I keep coming back to the sound. People think a blizzard is quiet, all that soft snow. It is not quiet. It is a freight train that never passes, a roar that gets into your skull and pushes out thought, until all you have left is the next step, and the rope at your waist, and the small animal certainty that the man on the other end of it knows something you don't. We found the cattle by smell before we saw them. 140 head bunched in the lee of the cottonwoods along the creek, tails to the wind, heads down, drifted into their bellies, breath rising off the herd in a single fog. Alive. All of them as far as we could count, and Calder counted, moving down the edge of them with his lips moving, while I stood there with something breaking loose in my chest that I'd been holding tight since I heard Buck hit the fence. They were alive, but they were trapped, and there was no feed, and the creek was their only water, and it was going under the ice and the drift both. They'll stand here and starve in 2 days, Calder said, close to my ear, or the drift'll come up over them in the night and they'll smother. The cottonwoods are the worst place they could have picked and the only place they could have gone. He wiped ice off his eyebrows. We can't move 140 head in this. We move what we can to where they can live, and the rest is up to the storm and them. Move them where? He'd already worked it out. He always had. The old loading chute and the windbreak by your south barn, half a mile. Solid board fence on the windward side, you've got that lean-to roof, and there's hay in that barn you did manage to put somewhere useful. A flat look. We cut out as many as we can drive and we walk them up. The young ones, the bred heifers, the ones with the best odds. We leave the old and the strong because the old know how to stand a storm and the strong can take it. He looked at me, and this is the part I want you to hear. But you have to choose, Marsh. They're your cattle, you know them. I can't tell a heifer worth saving from one that'll die anyhow. You walk the herd and you pick, and whatever you don't pick, you leave, and you don't get to come back for them. Can you do that? This is the second hard thing I was made to do in 2 hours, and it was worse than the first, because Buck had been taken from me, and these I had to take myself. I'll be honest about how it went, because I've made it sound cleaner in my head over the years than it was. I walked into the middle of my own herd in a whiteout, and I played God with a numb hand and a frozen heart. I knew these animals. I knew which heifer had thrown twins last spring, and which old cow had nursed 3 calves not her own, and which bull-headed steer would fight us the whole half-mile. I touched their backs as I went, the way you'd touch the shoulders of people in a crowd, and I said you and not you, and Calder cut the ones I picked out of the bunch and started them moving with a willow switch and a low, steady cussing that the cattle, for some reason, listened to. I left the old bull. He was 12 and arthritic, and he'd thrown me good calves for a decade, and he watched me with his head down out of the storm, and I left him because Calder was right. He knew how to stand, and the energy it would take to drive him was energy that would save 2 younger animals. I left a cow I'd hand-raised on a bottle when her mother died. A cow named Dorothy, named her actually, called her Sugar, and I'd never had the heart to ship her. I left Sugar standing in the cottonwoods because she was 9 years old and tough as a tractor tire, and I needed her spot in the drive for a first calf heifer who'd never see spring without it. I want to tell you, I made every cut by cold arithmetic. I didn't. I picked Sugar's neighbor over a better animal because I couldn't stand to take her one companion. I left a perfectly savable steer because my hands had stopped working and I miscounted, and by the time I knew it, the cut was made and Calder wouldn't let me go back. You don't get to come back for them. He told me, and he meant it, and it was the rule that kept us alive, and it is the rule I have hated longest. We cut out 51 head, drove them half a mile through hell, lost 2 on the way. 1 went down in a swale and wouldn't get up, and we had to leave it because stopping for it meant losing the rest, and 1 simply vanished, there and then not there, swallowed by white between 1 step and the next, and we never found it, alive or dead. 49 made the windbreak. 49 out of 140, plus whatever the cottonwoods spared, and as it turned out, the cottonwoods were more merciful than I'd feared. But I didn't know that for 3 days, and I grieved every one of them in the meantime. We got them behind the board fence and forked down hay and broke a hole in the stock tanks, forming ice. And then we stood there, the 2 of us, 2 miles of round trip behind us and the dark coming down, and the wind on our backs had become the wind in our faces, because we'd turned for home. Wind on my back, he'd said, and now the wind was on my face, and that meant home, but it also meant the storm had me walking into its mouth. We almost didn't make it back. I won't drag you through every yard of it. I'll tell you the moment that mattered. About halfway home, in the worst of the open ground between the south barn and the house, I went down. Not dramatically. My legs just quit, the way a wind-up toy quits, and I sat down in the snow, and the most reasonable thought I have ever had in my life arrived gently and completely. I'll just rest here a minute. You've maybe read that this is how the cold kills you, that at the end it feels warm, feels like rest, feels like the kindest thing in the world to lie down. I'd read it too. I'd read it and thought, not me, I've got sense. I want to tell every person who thinks they've got sense. Sense is the first thing it takes. I sat in the snow 200 yards from my own house, and I was not afraid, and I was not cold anymore, and I was, for the first time since Dorothy died in the garden 4 years before, completely at peace. And that peace was death dressed up as mercy, and I'd have walked right into it smiling. The rope at my waist went tight. Calder hauled. He couldn't see me, 12 feet of rope, and he couldn't see me, but he felt me stop, and he hauled. And when I didn't get up, he came back down the rope hand over hand and got his face into my face and screamed something I couldn't hear and slapped me, open-handed, hard enough that I felt it through the numbness, which is to say barely, which is to say it was the only thing in the world I could feel, and that one point of pain was a thread, and I followed it back up out of the warm dark into the screaming white. He didn't carry me. A man can't carry another man through that. He did something worse and better. He made me carry myself. He got me up and he got behind me and he put his hands flat on my back and he pushed, and he kept pushing 200 yards into the wind, into the dark, with his own legs surely as gone as mine, and he did not stop pushing, and he did not let me stop until the smear of my barn light resolved out of the white, and then the house, and then the door. We fell through it together. We lay on Dorothy's kitchen floor in a spreading puddle of melt, neither of us able to speak for I don't know how long, the storm howling at the windows like it had been cheated, and when I could finally make words, I said the only thing there was to say. You should have let me down there. You almost died coming back for me. He lay on his back staring at my ceiling, chest heaving, and he said, and this is the closest he ever came in 5 days to telling me anything about himself, I've let people go down before, Marsh, 2 of them. A long time ago, and it wasn't snow, but it was the same choice, and I made it the easy way, and I've lived in a hole ever since trying to figure out if I was right. He turned his head and looked at me on the floor. I'm done making it the easy way. I didn't ask who. I've never asked who. There are some doors a man holds for you and you don't walk through them. You just leave them open and let him know you saw. That was the end of the first day. 4 more were coming, and they would be, in their own quiet way, harder than the first, because the first day was a sprint, all adrenaline and crisis and clear tasks. And what came next was the long, grinding siege of it, the part nobody tells stories about because it's mostly waiting, mostly cold, mostly 2 men and a dwindling woodpile and the slow mathematics of survival, mostly the thing that breaks you that isn't drama at all. We rationed. Calder ran my house like a ship now, and I let him, because the man who'd looked at the sky 3 days early had earned the wheel. He killed the heat in every room but the kitchen, and we sealed the doors with rolled towels. He inventoried my pantry out loud and made it last by thirds. We melted snow for the horses on the wood stove in shifts through the night, because the pump was dead just like he'd said it would be. The poles down somewhere out in the dark just like he'd said they'd be. And a horse drinks 10 gallons a day and won't eat snow enough to live. And so we melted and melted and melted. And the woodpile he'd made me think I had plenty of began, by the second night, to look like a thing with a bottom. And on the second night, with the wind still climbing and no end to it on any horizon, Calder did the figuring he didn't want to do, sitting at my kitchen table with my own weather ledger open in front of him. He'd found it. He'd been reading it, 40 years of my mornings, and he looked up at me with the firelight on his ruined face and he said, "We've got wood for 3 more days if we burn it careful and let this room get cold enough to hate. The storm's got at least 4 more in it. Your own records say a northwest system like this one in 04 ran 6. He tapped the page. He'd found my own evidence and used it against my hope, which is a thing only an honest man will do to you. Your good standing timber is up the north draw, 1/2 a mile. We cut and we drag it back through this, or we run out of fire in the dark on the 4th night with 2 more to go." He closed the ledger gently, the way you'd close a Bible. "And I'm not strong enough to do it alone, Marsh. I need you. The man I had to drag 200 yards yesterday. I need that man to go back out there tomorrow and cut wood in the worst of it, and I need to know before I sleep whether you've got it in you, because if you don't, I need tonight to make a different plan." The fire ticked. The mare stamped in the barn through the wall. The wind leaned on the house. And I sat there, 61 years old, a man who 3 days ago had underlined the word "won't" in a ledger about another man's chances, and I understood that the question on the table was no longer about Calder at all. I told him yes. I didn't feel it when I said it. That's a thing I've learned to make peace with, that courage, the real kind, the kind that gets you up off the floor and back out the door, almost never arrives as a feeling. It arrives as a sentence you say before you're ready, and then you have to go become the man who said it. I told Calder yes across my kitchen table on the second night with the fire ticking down, and I lay awake most of that night certain I'd lied. And in the morning I got up and put on the wool and the doubled socks, and I went out into the white and found out whether I'd lied or not. I hadn't, but it was the nearest thing. We cut wood on the 3rd day for 6 hours, and it was the longest day of my life, longer than the day we buried Dorothy, longer than the day the bank man came, longer than any day has a right to be. The north draw was sheltered enough that you could stand without the wind throwing you, which is the only reason it was possible at all. Calder ran the saw, an old bow saw, a hand thing, because the chainsaw's bar oil had gelled solid in the cold, and neither of us trusted a small engine in that air, and I limbed and dragged. We dropped 4 good dead-standing pines, the gray ghosts that make the best fast heat, and we bucked them into rounds we could move, and we dragged those rounds back through 1/2 a mile of snow on a sled Calder had lashed together out of 2 of my corral panels and a length of chain. Here is the thing about that day that I can't quite put into words and have stopped trying to. We didn't talk. There was nothing to say and no breath to say it with. But somewhere in those 6 hours, in the rhythm of it, him pulling the saw, me clearing, both of us leaning into the sled traces like a two-horse team. A thing happened between us that I have only ever otherwise had with my own father, dead now 30 years. On the days we worked cattle in silence and understood each other completely without a single word. I had spent 14 months deciding Calder was a broken man hiding from the world in a hole. And on the third day of the storm, I came to understand that he was the least broken man I'd ever stood beside, and that the hole wasn't where he hid from the world. It was where he'd gone to be worth something to it again, after a day a long time ago when he hadn't been. He'd practiced being ready for 14 months for a storm that might never come, the way some men practice prayer. And the storm had come, and he was ready, and so, barely, badly, but truly was I. We got the wood. We got enough. We dragged the last sled load through the gate as the third dark came down, and we stacked it dripping by the stove, and Calder looked at the pile and looked at my ledger and did his arithmetic and said, "That's the storm. We've got it now, however long it runs." And for the first time in 3 days, something in his face let go just slightly, just at the corners. Not a smile. A man that tired can't smile, but the thing underneath a smile. I thought we'd won. I want to be careful here, because this is the part of the story that I most often want to change and can't. The mare died on the 4th night. Not from the storm. From the cut along her chest, the one she'd gotten on the fence the first afternoon, the one we'd cleaned as best we could with a kitchen and no vet and no way to get one. It had gone bad deep where we couldn't see it. By the 4th evening she was off her feed and standing splay-legged with her head low, and Calder, who knew animals the way he knew weather, looked at her a long time in the lantern light and then put his hand flat on her neck and stood there, and I knew. I want to tell you we did everything. We did what 2 men with a wood stove and a melting pot of snow can do, which is not nothing and is not enough. By midnight she was down and couldn't rise, and she was suffering, and the storm was still screaming outside like it had been screaming for 4 days, and there was a decision to make, the third hard one, and it was mine to make because she was mine. I made it. I won't write down how. I'll only tell you that Calder offered to do it for me, offered twice, and I said no, and he didn't argue. He just stood with me in the cold of the barn with his hat off, a hermit. A man who'd left the whole human race, standing bareheaded in the freezing dark out of respect for one old gray mare and the man who loved her. And afterward he put his hand on my shoulder once and left it there a moment and took it away. That was the gray mare. That was the horse he'd gone out into the whiteout the first day to save, 11 minutes by my dead watch, and we lost her anyway on the 4th night. I have thought a great deal about whether that means his choice on the first day was wrong, whether he should have saved Buck instead, who at least died quick on the fence, instead of the mare who died slow on the 4th night. I've decided it's the wrong question. You don't get to know how it comes out when you choose. You choose with what you can see, and what he could see that first afternoon was a mare standing and a gelding gone, and he reached for the one he could reach. That's all any of us ever do. I'm done making it the easy way, he'd said. The easy way that day would have been to reach for nothing and pull me inside and let them both go. He didn't take it. He went out into the white for a horse that was going to die anyway, and he didn't know she was going to die anyway. And I have come to believe that going out not knowing is the whole of what it means to be brave. We dragged her out into the storm because we couldn't leave her in the barn with the cattle. And then we went back into the house, and we didn't talk, and the wood stove burned the wood we'd cut on the 3rd day, and outside the wind began, so slowly I didn't trust it, to drop. The 5th day dawned silent. I'd forgotten what silence was. 5 days of that freight train roar had become the floor of the world, and when it stopped I woke in the dark before dawn, certain that something was terribly wrong, and lay there with my heart going before I understood that the wrong thing was that nothing was wrong. The wind had quit. I got up and went to the window and scraped a porthole in the frost with my thumbnail. The sun was coming up on a world made entirely new. Every fence, every shed, every fold of ground I'd known for 61 years had been redrawn in smooth white. the drifts carved into long, clean dunes, the cottonwoods down in the bottoms bowed and silvered, and the sky was the hard, high, cloudless blue that only comes after. The blue Calder had pointed his chin at the day he told me to move my hay, the blue I hadn't believed in. The whole valley lay there gleaming and merciless, and so beautiful it stopped my breath. And I stood at Dorothy's kitchen window with frost melting under my thumb, and I cried, finally, for all of it. For Buck and the mare and Sugar I'd left in the cottonwoods, and the steer I'd lost by miscounting, and the wife who died in the garden 4 years gone on an afternoon just as ordinary and just as final as the one that started all this. When I turned around, Calder was up, sitting at the table with his coat already on, watching me. He didn't look away and he didn't pretend he hadn't seen. He just nodded once, the way you nod at a man who's carried something heavy and finally set it down. "Storm's gone," he said. "Storm's gone," I said. We went out to the cattle. The 49 we'd driven to the windbreak were all standing, gaunt, rimed white, but standing, and they came to the hay we forked down like the half-dead come to the living. And then we walked the 2 miles down to the cottonwoods, breaking trail through drifts to our thighs, neither of us saying what we were both braced for. The cottonwoods had held. I won't pretend it was all of them. We lost 11 in the bottoms. The old bull was down, gone in the night, and I knelt by him a while. And the cow I'd hand-raised, Sugar, the one Dorothy named, the one I'd left because she was tough as a tractor tire, Sugar was alive. Sugar was alive, and so were most of the rest. Standing in the trampled-down lee of the trees, they'd had the animal wisdom to choose. And when she saw me, she lifted her head and made the low sound she'd made since she was a bottle calf. And I put my forehead against her frozen neck, and I stayed there longer than a grown man has any reason to. Calder counted. He always counted. 129 head out of 140. We'd lost 11, and I'd grieved 100 for 3 days, and the relief of it nearly put me on the ground. "That's a good winter's number," Calder said, "for a storm like that. Better than you'd have run alone." He didn't say better than you deserved, though we both heard it, and I didn't argue because it was true. He left the next morning. I should have known he would. I'd let myself imagine, in some soft place I didn't examine, that 5 days like that would change the arithmetic, that a man can't drag another man 200 yards through death and stand bareheaded over his dying horse and cut his winter wood beside him and then just walk back to a hole in the rock alone. I imagined wrong. That's not how it changed him, and it's not how it changed me, and I think the not changing of it is the part I most needed to understand. He stood in my doorway with his rope coiled over his shoulder and his brass compass on its lanyard, and the sun blazing off 5 days of new snow behind him, and I tried to say some of what I owed him and made a poor job of it, the way men do. "You could stay," I said. "There's room. God knows there's room. Dorothy's empty side of the bed, Dorothy's quiet kitchen, the whole hollowed-out house I'd been rattling around in for 4 years calling it living." He looked at me a long moment, and there was kindness in it, real kindness, and that's how I knew the answer was no before he said it. "I'm not staying away from people because I hate them, Marsh." He settled the rope on his shoulder. "I went up in that rock because down here I'd stopped being any use to anybody, and a man who's no use to anybody and knows it is a dangerous thing, mostly to himself. Up there I'm ready. Up there I'm watching the sky for the next one, and there'll be a next one." He almost smiled again, the thing under the smile. "You found that out this week. The next one's always coming. The only question's whether anybody saw it in time. And you'll just sit up there, waiting." "I'll sit up there ready," he said. "That's not the same as waiting. You of all people ought to know the difference now." He nodded at the office where my ledger was, 40 years of mornings, the thing Dorothy called the saddest hobby a man ever had. "You've been getting ready your whole life. You just never had to use it before." He stepped off the porch into the snow. And then he stopped and turned half back and said the last thing he ever said to me that mattered, the thing I've carried up to this kitchen window every single morning since. Keep writing it down, Calder said. Every morning, not because the numbers matter. He squinted up at the new blue sky, the sky he trusted the way other men trust people. Because the morning a man stops looking up is the morning the sky starts winning. Then he walked north, up the broken ground toward his cave, a smear of dark moving across all that white, smaller and smaller, until the distance took him the way the storm had taken the barn light 5 days before. That was 11 years ago. Calder's gone now, not dramatically, not in any storm. An old man's heart up in his rock, found in the spring by a hunter who'd never have gone up that draw if I hadn't taught my grandson, the one who hunts that country now, to check on the man in the cave when the snow ran late. I buried him on my own ground in the corner where Dorothy is, because he had no people that anyone ever found, and because by the end he was mine, or I was his. I've never been sure which way it ran, and I've decided it doesn't matter. I still keep the ledger. 40 composition books has become past 50. I still fidget with the dead pocket watch while I write, though some mornings now I think the not working of it is the point, that there's a kind of time a watch can't keep, and a man learns to keep it himself, by looking up. Every morning I write the temperature and the wind and what the clouds are doing, and then I do the thing Calder never knew I'd start doing, the thing I've never told anyone until now. I look north, up the broken ground, toward the rock where the cave still is. And some mornings, when the pressure's falling like a stone down a well and the western sky has that look it had 11 years ago, that look I didn't believe in once, I find myself talking to a dead man out a frosted window. I see it, I tell him. It's coming. I'm ready. I don't know if he hears me. I've made my peace with not knowing. He'd have told me that's the whole of it anyway, that you do the thing not knowing how it comes out, that you go out into the white for the horse that might already be lost, that you reach for the one you can reach.